Welcome to Nostalgic Medicine, a look back at the history of medicine and healthcare. In today's video, we'll have a look at the Doctors Riot of 1788. An angry mob marched towards New York Hospital as they were seeking payback for the horrendous acts that were recently carried out by the doctors. The doctors in the hospital were desperately trying to block the doors to the entrance, but the crowd were pushing back against them with tremendous force, and with their huge numbers, nothing could stop them. What could have possibly happened to have led to this? The events leading up to the Doctors' Riot contained aspects of medicine, racism, death, and robbery. America had just recently gained independence in the late 18th century, and the first few medical schools had recently been established in the country. Doctors still largely trained by undertaking apprenticeships during this time, but going to medical school was becoming more and more common, as it enabled the doctor to become more knowledgeable and well-rounded. Ever since Vesalius performed human dissections in 1543, and disproved many long-held beliefs about the human body, the medical community came to the agreement that the best way to learn medicine was through detailed dissections of recently deceased people. But there was a huge problem with this. Most doctors at the time didn't have a formal license to practice in many parts of the world, so there was no government-sanctioned method of obtaining these bodies that they desperately needed. It was also considered to be extremely taboo to have your body cut up before your death, so pretty much nobody wanted to donate their body for medical research. So like doctors have always done, they got to thinking, and came up with a devious plan to get their hands on some cadavers. They decided to steal them from graveyards, and had to be quite elusive with it, as the practice was illegal. For the best results, they had to steal a body less than 2 weeks after it was buried. Any longer, and it would have been too decomposed for use. The best time to collect bodies was during the winter, as the heat of summer increased the rate of decomposition. Some doctors would perform the thefts themselves, others got students to do it, or hired people who were specially trained for the job, who became known as resurrection men. It was an incredibly lucrative business, as both the money and the huge educational value that was generated from stealing the bodies heavily outweighed the relatively small fine or punishment that was handed out at the time. Some of the families of the deceased caught on to this thievery and tried to counter it by placing locked cages over the loved ones' graves, or by camping near the cemetery in the days after their burial so that no one could steal the body. So it all became like a very tense game of chess. The demand for bodies by hospitals and medical schools was so high that some resurrectionists even decided to murder innocent people to maintain a steady supply. And as you might expect, all of this horrific stealing of bodies gave doctors a very bad reputation among the general population, especially in America, and it all came to a breaking point with a massive riot that rocked New York City in the year 1788. The city had a single medical school called Columbia College, with the school using New York Hospital to carry out their dissections. A prominent doctor called Richard Bailey taught medicine to the students at the school, and just like everywhere else in the country, the local graveyards were regularly raided for bodies to be used. But the situation in New York City was slightly different. The city had a population that was about 20% black, most of whom were slaves. And the racism of the time meant that black people were buried in a completely separate burial ground, which stood just outside of the city's limits. meaning that the black bodies were easy pickings for the medics. This was in contrary to the generally richer white population that were largely unaffected by the corpse theft, as they could not only afford the protective measures to prevent their graves from being robbed, but also would have been able to influence the town's mayor to crack down on them if it did happen to their loved ones. But probably due to the body snatchers becoming careless with their deed, the black freedmen of the city began to realise what was happening, and rumours started to spread that Dr. Bailey was cutting up his patients and performing cruel experiments upon the sick, so they decided that something needed to be done about it. They initially sent a petition, which was actually quite a reasonable one. The black men recognised the scientific need for dead bodies to be used by medical schools, but they wanted the acquisition of corpses to be performed in a more civilised and well-regulated way, rather than by an underground movement in the middle of the night. But the petition was completely ignored, and the reputation and respect of the doctors was at rock bottom, and it all came to a head on a cold night in April of 1788. A few children were playing outside of New York Hospital, and they ended up spotting one of the dissecting rooms through a window. One of Dr. Bailey's medical students was in the middle of cutting the arm of a corpse, but when he noticed that the children were watching him, he tried to scare them away by waving the arm at them, then screamed at one of the children saying, "This is your mother's arm. I just dug it up." Well, as luck would have it, one of the children's mother had just recently died. The boy ran home and told his father, and when the father dug up his recently deceased wife's grave, her body was missing. So the riot was on. The father gathered an angry mob of 2,000 people that same night, who marched up to the hospital demanding Mr. Hicks to be handed over. But the demand wasn't met, so they forced their way into the hospital. One of the first things they saw was a room containing several bodies that were half mutilated and hung up by their genitals. This was a shocking scene to behold, causing the crowd to become more enraged than ever, and they began to destroy any hospital equipment that they could get their hands on, trashing the entire building in the process. Any dead corpses that the rioters came across was collected and given a prompt reburial. By the time the crowd broke in, most of the doctors and students in the hospital had already fled the building through windows, or hid in places like chimneys. The medics that couldn't escape were dragged into the street by the crowd, but just before the mob was able to execute sweet vengeance on them, New York City's Mayor James Duane fought his way through the crowd and ordered the doctors and students to be escorted to the local jailhouse for their protection. But this was just the beginning, as the crowd were by no means satisfied. The rioting continued to the next day, with the size of the crowd increasing from 2,000 people to now over 5,000. The riot spread to the entire city, as people were now searching for more bodies in the homes of doctors, as well as in the rooms of Columbia College, with none other than United States founding father Alexander Hamilton pleading at the front steps of the college, but failing to convince the crowd not to enter. The final place that they descended on was the very same jail that the doctors and students were being held at for their protection, and seeing that the riot was only intensifying, Mayor James Duane called in the militia to guard the jail and restore some order. The crowd started to throw rocks and bricks towards the jail, but the militia were given orders to hold their fire. But then some prominent officials were hit with flying objects, so the militia opened fire in retaliation. The riot would eventually die down a few hours later, but the shootings that occurred would lead to 20 people dying. In the months following this chaotic event, many doctors and students were brought to trial, but John Hicks, the person who started it, strangely wasn't among them. When Dr. Bailey was questioned about all the grave robbing that happened on his behalf, he responded that he never told anyone to steal bodies from graves inside the city. A convenient response, as the Negroes' burial ground just happened to be located outside of the city. The trial failed to convict anyone from either sides of the conflict, and the opinion of doctors in the city dropped to an all-time low, with newspapers removing all advertisements of services provided by doctors. Several more anatomy riots would happen over the next few decades in many other places around America, which eventually led the government to pass several laws called bone bills, which not only explicitly forbade grave robbing, but also made it so that criminals executed for things like murder, arson, and burglary would have their bodies given to hospitals and medical schools for dissection as an extra punishment. Despite these laws that were passed, there still remained a shortage of bodies to be dissected for many years after this. The demand only started to be met when a movement was created to try and remove the stigma of being dissected, and instead to encourage people to donate their bodies after their death, by making them see it as a gift from them to science. The utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham led by example, and was among the first people to do this after he died in 1832. So nowadays, pretty much every medical student in the developed world learns anatomy by a hands-on approach, where they dissect a donated person's body, and all doctors and students are incredibly thankful to our donors for providing us with an adequate supply of cadavers. But this actually isn't the case in several places in the developing world, where due to either religious beliefs or lack of resources, many medical institutions just don't have enough cadavers to teach with. And indeed, an estimated tens of thousands of bodies are still stolen from graves in these countries, with some bodies even being sold to respected institutions in Europe and America. So as much as we'd like to think of grave robbing as a strange practice from many centuries ago, it still very much lives on to this day.